Hello, this is Let's Talk About Myths, baby, and I am your host, Liv, here with a very quick introduction for a returning guest we all know and love. Joel Christensen returned to the show, this time not to talk directly about the Homeric epics, though indirectly, definitely still the Homeric epics, but instead to talk about a new book he has out called Storylife. And I am always happy to have Joel back. He is incredibly supportive and generally doing good things when it comes to ancient history and welcoming people into that realm. And so I'm thrilled to have yet another conversation with him. And yes, there will be another one soon. We didn't really plan it like that. It's just we've been recording them over like months and months, and now they're lining up. But we had to talk about toxic masculinity in the Iliad, so you will forgive me when another episode with Joel comes out next month. For now, enjoy Storylife. Conversations When Science Meets Storytelling. Storylife with Joel Christensen. But why don't you tell me about the new book and what you were looking at?
All right. So the book is called Storylife, and the subtitle is on epic narrative and living things. And the sort of summary of it is that it's a series of biological analogies applied to epic poetry, myth, and how stories function like among human beings to try to understand the impact that narrative has on our lives. And there's sort of like there are a couple different aims with it. Aim number one is to decenter author and authority, and to get us thinking more about how creative works come from communities. Aim number two is to get us to think about narrative as not having authorial intention, but having a sort of life and mind of its own. And aim number three is to ask, or really to give examples of how narrative functions negatively, and to get us to think of it as a type of parasite or virus that has a function of its own. And so the soft form of the question of my proposal in the book is that narrative is like a living thing. The hard form is that it is actually essentially alive, and that we should treat it as such, and that it has its own agency and interests, and that we are its environment and its host, not necessarily its beneficiaries.
That's very interesting. So scientific.
It is, and it isn't. But I mean, like I use DNA and epigenetics and thinking about how the fabric of epic narrative comes together. I use evolutionary biology to think about where different narrative traditions come from. So I compare the Iliad and Gilgamesh in one chapter, and look into arguments for their origins and similarities. And then I focus really near the end on symbiosis and how much of our DNA, 8%, is made up of viruses and other beings that's been integrated into who we are, and offering up different models, mutualism as opposed to parasitism, to get us to think about the interaction between narratives and their environment, which is us, which is human society. So that's sort of like, and I use my use of epic is sort of double-sided. One, as you know from our earlier conversations, people don't talk about epic and where it comes from the way I do. And so I'm always sort of that's my jam. Let's think about how we can think more deeply about epic and its structure. But on the other side is that epic is a good test case. People are not familiar with its language; it's distant, and so if you want to say, look, Homeric epic develops without an author, it has intention and direction of its own. I think it's a good way to start people down the path to think, well, maybe your own book that you write actually comes from a place that's not just you. And we have to think
Mm-hmm.
about what the consequences of that are.
Yeah. Okay, that's absolutely fascinating. I'm trying to form like a question about it because I just want to. I mean, I just want to hear
Okay.
more.
Well, yeah. Well, yeah.
Like,
So I start out. Look. So in the earlier episode, I talked a little bit about the structure of early Greek poetry, how each line is its own sort of self-contained unit of meaning, and how it's built up of different structures. The point I make in the first two chapters of Story Life is that you can actually take recourse to multicellular life and DNA to think about two things. One, how language unfolds in its environment. Any given word that you use, right, has no meaning in isolation, right?
mm-hmm.
It doesn't have meaning until it's activated in its environment. And that environment is both the other words around it, so other genes, other cells, but also the people who listen to it and give it meaning and activate it. And so that's part of it. And I really ask people to think about both morphology, the shape of words and lines, and the semantics, their meaning, from a perspective of what the audience does to it. And so I try to use the language of DNA and epigenetics to defamiliarize ourselves from what's a really simple thing to us, right? We have language, it works. We're like, it's that simple, right? But it's not that simple. It's much more complex, and we have many different fields of linguistics to try to help us understand it. So there's that, like that's the first chapter, thinking about DNA and language and the basic shape of the line of a line of epic poetry. A second one is a larger problem. So as I think we talked on the in the earlier episode, many people accept the oral derivation of the Homeric poems,
mm,
but far fewer are willing to say that the structures that we have don't bear the imprint of human designers. And so I suggest instead, I say, well, look, let's take the model of multicellular life, right? It's built through repetition of the same types of cells until they have to specialize in their environments in different ways. And so I lay out, it's not just about the lines of Homeric epic, right? The individual lines, but they're built of doublets, triplets, ring structures, and other repetitions that you don't actually have to plan for. It just naturally stacks until you get to a certain point of complexity where people say, well, clearly it's planned. And
mm,
so in this chapter, and this is something I think we talked about before too, I emphasize that there's also a relationship between the structure of that poetry and how narrative works with our minds. So one of the things that I emphasize both in my last book and this one is a cognitive approach to narrative that understands that when you and I read the same story, right, we don't actually read the same story, right?
mm,
We create a version of the story that's a combination between our experiences and the information we're getting from the story. Right. So if you and I are reading a story about a princess escaping from a castle, what the princess looks like, what the castle looks like, will depend on our experience of the world and narrative. How we imagine the body moving in space will also have to do with our own experience of our bodies moving in space. And based on the way we're gendered in this society and we move through the world, you and I will likely have separate versions, or very different versions of that in our mind. So
mm-hmm.
this to me is an example of, you imagine the story unfolding like DNA in its environment, right? You and I could both adopt the same amphibious egg and raise it, but the frogs would develop differently because we might feed it differently, might have different environments for it, etc. Right? But the point I make is that Homeric poetry is built of ring structures that pose openings and then closings and then information in between, and encourages you to reflect on the information in between in a mirroring way. whether it's speech openings and closings, introductions and closings, or
Mm-hmm.
similes, right? Where someone says,
Mm.
Hector goes forth like a snowy mountain, right? And there's movement in the similes, and you're encouraged to think about the outside of a comparison and the inside. And
Mm.
so at the end of the second chapter, I don't look at Homer. I actually look at Sappho fragment 16, which
Hmm.
is the famous one where, some people say the most beautiful thing on this dark earth is a cavalry. Some people say infantry. Some people say it's a navy. I say it's the one you love. But then from that opening frame, Sappho
Mm.
says, and so Helen left her husband and fell in love with Paris. And she goes through that story. And then she says, and this reminds me of Anactoria, whose lovely walk I would rather watch than all the Lydian chariots on the earth. Right. And so it shows a model of reading that actually echoes what cognitive scientists say happens when we listen to a story, which is that we look at something in a narrative, we compare it to ourselves, and then we produce a blend of the two. And that's really what Sappho does in Fragment 16, and what's actually going on throughout Epic is that it's modeling a type of reading that is reinforced by the ring composition structure that is intrinsic to the stacking form and repetition of Homeric epic. So rather than being the product of someone saying, oh, this is a good idea, I think it would work, it's just what happens with narrative anyway, and has stuck because it's so effective and it's such a reinforcement of what our brains are already doing. Right. So
Mm-hmm.
that's essentially like an overview of chapters 1 and 2. I don't know if it makes sense. Sometimes I feel like I'm the guy at the bulletin board with all the strings and everything. But I think that's a way of at least getting you to that point.
Yeah. I mean, it's so intricate in a way that I'm definitely like, I'm wrapping my head around it. I am. But I'm thrilled to hear about the Sappho reference. Also, it's funny, I've been weirdly coming across that name Anactoria a lot lately. And it's a bizarre name to then suddenly be like, oh, I feel like I just keep seeing this.
Yeah.
It's a favorite. But so when it comes to epic, like, okay, I'm trying to wrap my head around everything, which it's so interesting. And also epic generally is so interesting. So you mentioned comparing the Iliad and Gilgamesh, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yeah.
in this, does it fit in with that? Could you tell me more about that? And I'm hoping that will also help to
Yeah.
explain all of the layers that you just went through.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the next chapter, so the name of chapter 3 is Crabs and the Monomyth, which
Amazing.
yeah. And so the argument I make there, well, first I start with what we do when we see similarities in narrative traditions. And the
Mm.
reason I focus on the monomyth thing is the obsession with Joseph Campbell's monomyth, that there's this one story, and there are generally two different ways. I mean, there's a big criticism of Campbell, which I'll get to in a minute. But when there are similarities in traditions, people take recourse to two different things, right? And these are extremes, of course, but one is, all right, there's a genealogy here. So one leads back to the other, and we need to trace it to the primary authority because that's important, right?
Mm-hmm.
The
The original
second,
myth, quote
yeah,
unquote.
the original, the Ur myth, which of course should come from Uruk, right? But the other side is like a recourse to universalism that, again, like, well, what does that even mean? If we're like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, this is a universal, like we all have eyes and bodies, therefore sometimes we talk about looking at hands. I mean, what does that actually do for us, right?
Yeah.
And so, right, as a way of dealing with the many, many problems of the monomyth, which, again, a simple criticism is that it's cherry picking a bunch of details to adhere to one sort of Western narrative detail. I instead introduce a couple notions from evolutionary biology. And so the example I use is the development of crab morphology. So crabs, we have 7 different type things that look like crabs that developed independently, right? They're not from the same family tree. And the fossil record adds at least 4 more. And so there are 11 crab formations in the history of the planet Earth, and they don't come from the same family tree. Instead, they come from an interaction between organisms and their environment. The crab morphology develops to answer certain problems in the natural world, right? And so for me, this is a great metaphor for thinking about, why we choose the narratives we do, right? And how do we find that balance of like, all right, we have these genes, we'll call them narrative genes, like the kernels of narrative, and we select for them or they develop in certain ways based on their environment. And so the model I use from that is in evolution, there are two types of things. There's parallel evolution and convergent. And so in one, right, like you from completely different genetic trees, you evolve in parallel based on the demands or interaction with your environment. Another is that, you come from similar backgrounds, but diverge and then converge again, based on the environment. And so the question I ask in chapter three, when I talk about the similarities between the Gilgamesh tradition and the Iliad, is how do we imagine this? Like, do we imagine Homeric poetry and Gilgamesh poems coming from the same family tree? And even if they do, why would they select for certain details? And how do we understand it if we look to the natural world instead of our basic tree models that we have in scholarship? And so I suggest that, like, one of the important things is audiences don't know, right? They, audience of ancient Greece never knew anything about Gilgamesh, right? And so why would we privilege certain details? Why do we end up having stories that are roughly similar? And the ones I look at a couple examples, but sort of like fear of mortality, like female characters offering like an out from it, and like the rhetoric of immortal fame, right? Like if you distill it down to those basic details, you could make the argument pretty simply that, well, this could just be parallel evolution, right? Because the environment that it's answering, like you have similar cultural environments in the Eastern Mediterranean, where you have similar family structures, ideas about life and death and gender, right? All of these things are already latent, right? And then you have similar class pressures and similar social functions for narrative. And so it actually shouldn't be surprising if there are themes and motifs that are shared. And I actually use a comparison I use is the song Spanish Pipe Dream by John Prine, which if you look at it like in the same way Joseph Campbell would for a monomyth, you could say, oh, it's part of the same tradition. Do you know Spanish Pipe Dream?
No.
All right. So it's a song where this guy, the basic narrative is this guy is a sailor who's on break. And he goes to a strip club, and the dancer there tells him like he should give up war. It's not worth it. They should move to the country and have children, have a farm, and let them figure out their life on their own. And so in ways like engagement with martial discourse, woman as sort of a alternative figure, promise of children for glory instead of like the rhetoric of glory. It checks all the boxes that you get in like Gilgamesh's speech with the barmaid and Achilles' speech with Thetis and others. And I'm like, nobody in the world thinks that John Prine was reading Gilgamesh and the Iliad. Instead, what you have is a natural, you could call it universal, but I think a human embodied response to a particular set of inputs that we can think of in terms of an ecosystem. And so one of the things I emphasize is that you should think of audiences and their cultural contexts in the way that we think of ecosystems and life forms, right? It's a complex relationship that allows narratives to develop to fulfill particular functions. And I think if we look at Gilgamesh and other, the monomyth and other traditions like that, it's a richer, much more complicated way of looking at narrative development that looks at all sides of it. It's not just about supply side poetics, like who's telling the story, but it's also about audience need and their response to it.
Yeah, that's okay. That's very interesting. I keep just saying that's very interesting.
You can also say it's crazy. But...
No, it's not crazy. It's just more that I'm like, I mean, I think it's just more that I feel like that sounds so reasonable to me. Like, specifically that side of just the way a narrative would evolve. Like, I mean, I've definitely heard the idea that, that Gilgamesh has similarities with the Iliad, but I guess I haven't investigated that much into sort of what is said about why. And I
Yeah.
also have never read Joseph Campbell, and that is fine with me.
It,
Um,
it's much better for you that way.
I think so. I know enough to know I don't need to read him.
Yeah.
But I mean, it seems to me that just seems so reasonable that these stories would have similarities because they're just evolving in similar you've used a word so many times and now I can't find it. But similar
Environment. Just say
situations, environments,
context,
environment, that was the word. I'm just doing really well today and I can't think of the word environment. Well, but it just seems so reasonable. But the alternative would be that one was being learned from the other. Is that kind of what else is being said about
the
these?
the other alternative people say is that like one story is taken, right?
Right.
But
right.
I can't remember if I used this analogy with you before, but the one I always use. So I always thought that if one culture borrows a thing from another, there are two things going on there. One, they're taking something that they recognize a need for, right? But they're also taking something that has reference in their world, right? So let's say the ancient Greeks took Gilgamesh. Well, it's because there's a Gilgamesh-sized hole in their world, right? And the analogy I use in the opening of the book is of like a tree in a garden, like a manicured tree, right? When we look at the placement of a tree, most of the time we don't think about it. But if we think about it, we're like, oh, well, who planted it? Right? Like whose choice was it to put it there? But then we don't go to the next step, which is what are the aesthetics of treeness that we share as a society that brought it there, one. And two, what about the human engagement and domestication of the plants that made it possible for this tree to thrive in this environment that it's not made for? And if we add all these things up, like, to what do we give the credit of the appearance of this tree? Is it the gardener, right? Is it the designer of the garden? Is it the first person to like domesticate a sugar maple for a garden? I mean, you just go on and on and on, right? When again you get to the one end, you have someone appreciating a tree in a garden, right? And on the other, you have just wild trees. But along the way, you have this interaction between human beings and the environment, and a thing that's both found and curated, that has to be both, or else it's neither.
Yeah.
So I don't know if we want to say, well, Achilles is a tree or Gilgamesh is a tree, but I mean that's essentially what I'm also saying, which is that these narrative traditions, like a storyteller receives story traditions. And we know that most of the time, what makes storytellers exceptional is timeliness. So they're there telling a story that people need at a particular time, but also their ability to work within the tradition, to push it to something that's slightly different and interesting to people, but not so different and strange that people can't understand it or make sense of it.
Yeah.
Right? And so in that dance, right, between the novelty and the tradition, like we have come to such a place in like our modern world where we completely credit the innovation and we don't understand how much of what was already there had to be there for the innovation to get made.
Yeah. Makes me think of AI.
I talk about AI in the introduction. I'm basically like, it's crap, it's stupid. But also that, the big trick about AI that we're not acknowledging enough is that we're attributing meaning to its nonsense, right? We're actually doing, the post-production work, which is it gives us like, an average of our own gobbledygook, and we're like, now we give it meaning.
Yeah.
Right?
Because it still requires the human interaction. And so we're just, it just doesn't make any sense, I think, in any reasonable way other than just, that obsession with like, but we can do this.
Right. But the thing I just said, so that contribution that individuals make when they receive like narrative art and give it back again, right? That difference is based on the ability to combine your experience with what you're receiving and read it that way, right? AI has no experience. It doesn't actually think. It's not embodied. So it can't take it and innovate. This is why all the AI art is so boring and
Mm-hmm.
mediocre. It's because it actually has nothing to contribute.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and that's why I've talked about AI recently on the show, and just about how, because people asked me, my thoughts on using it to. It was something to do with like understanding, otherwise lost works, and I try to be kind in my replies on those things, because I also know I have very strong opinions. But like, I just think everything good and interesting about the ancient world and the work that came from it is the human interaction with it, is the
Yep.
humans taking it in back then, creating it back then, us taking it in now. And like, if there's some computer nonsense in the in between, breaking something down and then giving us something, like, I don't trust it, and I don't think it would have any of the like the humanity that makes art. I feel like that's such an obvious thing to say, but AI keeps happening, so maybe not.
Well, no, but I know, AI keeps happening because they want to steal all of our cultural material from us and then sell it back to us worse, right?
Yeah, because capitalism's cool.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
going
no,
well.
yeah, it's a transfer of wealth issue. There's nothing to do. If AI art were real, we wouldn't understand it because it would be related to AI experience, which
Yeah.
is completely alien to us,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? It's like, if actual space aliens showed up and they had an art form, the chance of us understanding it as art would be pretty slim. They would have to go back to like my models, right? They would have to have like cultural frameworks that are translatable to ours, and they would actually have to have embodied features that are in some way translatable to ours. They would have to see in the same spectrum, hear in the
Yeah.
same decibels, like, or some translational element. Otherwise, like if they were like light forms rather than like carbon life forms, we couldn't understand shit. Like
Yeah.
their art would seem like math to us, or would seem like fractal light shows.
Yeah.
Maybe we would get it, but we probably wouldn't because we're pretty solipsistic and dumb.
Yeah. Well, and
Right.
the only like it feels like this everything you've just said
Mhm.
essentially, but you've put such scientific, frameworks around, I think, what I've often been trying to understand about the appeal of AI, and but also like the ways I have been trying to find to explain why I hate it so much. So I love that this connection has been made, because my thing is, I can't put it into words beyond saying that it it isn't art because it lacks the humanity, and that is
Yeah.
what
Well,
is required in order to create art. And even if it has anything that looks like art, it's because it's taken it from human art.
right. And that's, to go back to like the supply side stuff. I mean, one of the things that I'm really animated about is that our notion of art and creation is so thoroughly dominated by two things. One, the God as our author model, and two, the artwork as intellectual property model, as something that can be commodified and sold,
Mm,
right? And those two things so thoroughly put the emphasis on the creator and completely divorce us from the audiences, right?
mm-hmm.
And we know, like in an area in which audiences matter, art is very different, right? When you're in a community and people are telling stories, singing songs, and audience members are involved and feeding back to them, it's not like a committee of executives saying we need to sell people AI in their refrigerators. Like, I don't want AI in my refrigerators. I want a refrigerator that lasts more than 10 years. Like, it's not that hard. Uh, but I mean, that it takes us back to, I mean, let's see, another way to get into this, so the later chapters of the book get crazier.
Great.
And you want to, so can I give you an origin story for the book? and then we could talk about some of those things.
Please.
Okay. So this book is very much a COVID book.
Mm.
And I wrote a blog post where the title was, Did COVID Write This Book? Because I started talking about some of these ideas with editors in probably the second fall of COVID, so 2021.
Mm.
And I'd spent so much time, well, like everybody, thinking about virology, right? But early on, not thinking about the actual virus, but instead thinking about all the stupid ideas and bad responses to the virus, right? And how quickly the facts of science or virology or vaccines, or mitigating the disease by wearing masks became a political issue, and suddenly, I mean, we're trying not to remember, but because he's back, but ivermectin, and bleach, and go out in the sun, it'll kill COVID, all that stuff that actually was harmful to people.
Mm-hmm.
That started making me think. So I'd always been thinking about not COVID, about narrative as akin to DNA. But I
Mm.
started to really think then, because we were past the fake news or alternative news thing, and I started thinking, well, what if we stop worrying about fake news and alternative news, and think about why some stories make people do what they do?
Hmm.
Because everything in that summer of 2020 through 2021, we had the election campaign, we had the Black Lives Matter movements, we had all the failure of our society to accept the mitigation. It was all driven by story.
Mm.
And so I actually, I wrote the book proposal, or finished it in the sample when I got COVID. I had like 10 days of a pretty bad fever. I sat down and wrote this out, because my real concern was like, how are we going to face the challenges we have in the future? Climate change, rising income inequality, rising violence, all this stuff, if we don't understand how stories make us choose things that are actually worse for us, right?
Hmm.
Our science, our technology has outpaced our ability to understand it, right? Instead, we have to sort of catch up and understand like how we get people to accept like the fruits of science and labor, and accept like maybe we do need to wear masks to protect people. Maybe it's not a bad thing, and so the fourth and fifth chapters of my book are about how narrative goes wrong.
Hmm.
So in chapter 4, I look at kleos narratives, so narratives of immortal fame in early Greece, and how they go in multiple directions, how we often misunderstand them.
Hmm.
And then chapter 5, which is something we've talked about before, but we can always hit again, is really a subtitle, if I had it, would be toxic heroism, and how heroic narratives are misunderstood and misused. And I start out by talking about the story of Cleomedes the Astypalaean, the boxer who goes back and kills a bunch of kids. And I end up talking about school shootings and narratives like that, as a way of sort of understanding how heroic narratives go wrong. And so
Mm-hmm.
these are the chapters where I use, symbiosis and mutualism and parasitism, to think about how narrative lives off of us and how we're not in control of it. And so, yeah, sorry, I just gave you way too much there, but what of that do you want to hear more about?
I mean, the thing is, I mean, I'm generally interested in all of it, but obviously my knowledge in terms of interacting with it would be around this like epic and myth and everything. And so I'm well, also like the toxic heroism I'm always down to talk about. But just generally, I don't even know what to ask, because I just want to know more about the epic side of it, I guess,
Okay.
or like, how you're looking at the growth and the way that epics did, basically what you came out of all of this very scientific, and therefore I have so much trouble even asking questions about it. But like, yeah, like I love the idea of it being able to be sort of tracked around epic, so I want to
Yeah.
know more.
All right. Let's start with the idea of kleos, right? This is the Greek word for fame, and glory, and it becomes, concretized in the Iliad as kleos aptaton, right? As imperishable fame.
Mm.
And so the thing we hear from Achilles when he first talks about it is he says, well, my mother Thetis says I have two choices, right? I can go home and like be, ignominious and, farm and nobody will ever remember me, or I can stay here and die young, and have immortal glory, right? So when people talk about the Iliad, and these are people who really don't understand it, they're like, well, this is the heroic code. This is the important message. But I actually think what the Iliad is showing is that is a story system that makes people make bad choices. And it can be for good, it can make you brave, but it can also make you value death more than life. And that is a crucial problem with it. And so what I do in that chapter is I actually look at evocations of Kleos in Greek poetry, in epic, in lyric, in inscriptions as well, to see how people use that narrative of sacrifice of life of like mortal life for immortal glory, to show how epic really complicates it and shows how it can be a impetus to bad decisions. And I use this as a way to think about, all right, let's talk about symbiosis, right? So symbiosis, a basic scientific idea, is like when two organisms live together. And what can happen over time is you can actually evolve with different organisms. So as human beings, I think Carl Zimmer says in his book about viruses that up to 8% of our DNA comes from other things that aren't mammalian, right? And so there's a moment in our history, in mammalian history, before we actually gestated fetuses in wombs, where we couldn't do it correctly because the placenta wouldn't connect in the way it does now. And it was actually an endogenous retrovirus that integrated into our DNA that allowed that to happen, and it was a mutation. In other versions of like the development of different creatures, this retrovirus was destructive. But we got lucky, and it made the placentation possible in mammals, which had then created an entire tree of life, right, in this way. And so many examples of how we have absorbed viral DNA into our organisms, and they've started out as what you call parasitic, but eventually they become beneficial, right? There's a type of mutualism. And so I suggest, look, let's think about story as a technology to start out, or let's think of it as an aspect of human beings, right? Like story and language is the thing that sets us apart from all other creatures that we know of, right? Like we know dolphins communicate, other animals communicate, but our ability to convey complex information means that you and I don't have to make the same mistakes our parents did, right? Or our grandparents and great grandparents, and we can
And
live,
yet.
right? And yet we do, but we can live, as people have said famously, like readers live 1,000 lives within one. Like we can have all this experience, right? So on one level, narrative gives us these resources as individuals. As groups, though, narrative is actually what gives us a sense of belonging and a sense of mission, right? Agency and belonging are the two primary things we need to be part of groups. And people have written, like, once you get above a certain level of organization, and Yuval Harari in his book Sapiens says it's like 300 to 600 people, narrative is crucial to get you to work together as a group. You need a story that binds you, that gives you a sense of identity. And so that sense of belonging and mission comes from narrative. It binds us together, and it's a fabulous technology because it actually allows us to work as much larger organisms. We just don't sense that that's happening because our bodies focus on what's right in front of us. And we have a prejudice towards an individual point of view that is, let's see, concretized and magnified by cultural frameworks, right, that say we're more important. I'm going to make sense with this, don't worry, right? But the problem is not all narratives that give us a sense of group belonging are positive to ourselves or to other groups, right? I mean, I don't need to point out too many examples, right?
I know. I'm just kind of
But
like, okay, I won't start screaming.
no, but our narratives that allow us to belong and work as corporate entities, other people, right? And they dehumanize others. They make it less than us. That also makes us resistant to information that challenges our core identity, right? So you can go to things, and I'm going to try to resist current events and look instead to, data I saw online recently is that surveys during the 1940s had 92% of Americans in favor of interning the Japanese in our country. 92%, right?
Jesus
None
Christ.
of that is based in facts. All of that is based in vibes, narrative vibes, a sense of who we are as opposed to other people, and an ability to justify cruelty for the
Mm-hmm.
sake of our notion of a common good, right? And this actually blinds us to certain things, right? Like, for instance, I don't know how many Americans have ever asked how many Iraqi and Afghani children we killed in the war on terror,
Mm.
right? And I mean, it's the tens, thousands, hundreds of thousands. We don't even know. We don't ask the question because it was for freedom. It was
Yeah.
justified, right? And so, like, in that chapter where I talk about class, I say, look, any story tradition that develops for social good can also mutate to social ill
Mm-hmm.
without anybody actually meaning to do it. It's about the environment. You deploy a narrative tradition in an environment and it will adapt and people will use it because they're levers that people are out there using without a plan. Now, some people do
Mm-hmm.
have plans, of course, and they use them deceptively. But all we have to do is look in the change of pace in conspiracy theories online, right? And how rapidly stories go. One of the things I've been thinking about lately is the double-mindedness you need to believe that the Democrats were capable of deploying hurricanes to disrupt voting in Georgia and Florida, but at the same time deny that human-made climate change is real,
I missed
right?
that one.
Yeah,
So
it was in the New York
good.
Times. It's a crazy one, and you and I are like, all right, like, that's madness, right?
Mm-hmm.
But on the other side, someone could say, look, I mean, you say climate change is real. If humans can change the climate, why can't we manipulate it for our own good, right? I mean, again, you're thinking, well, what the hell, right? Like, it's impossible. But I think one of the important things we need to do going forward is to stop, as much as we want to, judging people for the crazy shit they believe, and
Mm.
instead asking, what are the environmental factors? What are the contextual factors that make this an effective story for people to understand the world with,
Mm-hmm.
and what can we do about it, right?
Yeah.
And so when I look at Klaus narratives, I look, like, let's just imagine heroic narrative at a basic level. You need to convince people to stand up and risk their lives to defend their community, right? The narrative of glory facilitates that,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're a great person. You need all these honors, rewards for risking your life for the community because that's important. All right, that's stage one. But step two, and this is really where we're at the beginning of the Iliad, is, well, what happens if you've accepted all that and it's still not enough, right? What if you
Mm.
expect that as your position for someone who risks their lives for the community? You expect honor beyond everyone else, right? I think of it types of extra mortality at some
Mm.
level, wanting any type of life outside of our own, that which we're allotted, is vampiric, right? I mean, this is the peak of, like, weird techno capitalism. I keep forgetting the guy's name who's like using his own son's blood and plasma to live forever, right? But you don't
Yeah.
even need to go to that whack job. Just think about what is it? Health tourism. People who go to India to get a
Yeah.
new kidney, right? All of these things, like there is the desire to outstretch our mortal bounds is connected in part to the sense that we have more of a right to life than others, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we are at the beginning of the Iliad, right? I think at some level that type of heroism that positions Achilles at a point where he thinks he should be able to ask the gods to punish the Greeks for his suffering, it results in the death of myriad Achaeans, but it also results in the death of Patroclus, which
Mm-hmm.
is his greatest loss, right? And so Achilles' paroxysm, his rupture with his community and himself there, is an echo of the heroic narrative gone terribly wrong. And so I think the Iliad and the Odyssey are both deeply engaged in criticizing the heroic narrative and showing how it goes wrong, but most people don't get it, right? And that's a central theme of the Iliad and the Odyssey, is that we actually don't need these types of people. Like, they're harmful to us, except in very specific situations. So the notion of like a class narrative, to go back to that sort of environmental narrative that develops, that does good things for us, is, American patriotism. Let's go back to that one, right? Like, the idea of having a coherent identity built around freedom and independence is like, it's good. It creates it like at some level, it creates a desire. It gives you a a sense that you're in control of things. It breaks down old boundaries, but on the other, it obscures things like, we're the wealthiest nation on earth because we stole labor from millions of enslaved people, and we stole resources from millions of indigenous people. We didn't pay for any of that, right? And we're lucky because we have two oceans protecting us from the masses of Asia and Europe. And so, the narratives that we tell direct us to see things and not others.
Yeah.
And it is ultimately as harmful to us as it can be to other people.
Yeah. 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 Well, yeah. The American patriotism narrative specifically is such an interesting way to look at that, because, yeah.
Well, I'll give you an example.
But
No,
yeah.
just about correcting. No,
Yeah.
I'll give personal example because I think it'll help people. They can tell the stories they want to tell. But my maternal grandfather is about to be 98 years old. And about 4 years ago, he self-published his autobiography. He is, full disclosure, a Trumpist extraordinaire. And the story he tells about our family is that we're the bootstrappers. We worked really hard, unlike all these other people who get things, right? And the point. So that's the way he tells the story,
Mm-hmm.
right? And why other people shouldn't get handouts or steps up, right? But then, I asked him, and I've talked to him, I'm like, well, two fundamental things that happened in our family that put us where we are here is, one, the Homestead Act that allowed your father to come from Norway and get free land in Minnesota, and two, the GI Bill that allowed you to go to college for free and raise the family up to a new social class. I'm like, those were government actions, one. And two, the first, Homestead Act, like, relied on us displacing people from land and just taking land from others and giving it to you. And the GI Bill actually wasn't made available to all soldiers. Like, if you were Black, Latino, or Native,
Mm-hmm.
you didn't get that. Right. So these two things, I can tell a different story, where our family is the beneficiary of, white affirmative action,
Mm-hmm.
not of their own hard work. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so, people's sense of belonging, though, sense of identity, is so tied to specific narrative traditions. It shapes how we see the world and engage in it. And I guess that's where, I can talk more about the school shooting thing, but really where I go in the conclusion is, like, our world is filled with STEM stuff, and we have STEM problems, right? But if we don't have a science of narrative to understand how to communicate it and relate it to our identities and shared mission, we're never going to do anything with that knowledge, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because language and story is what creates communities, right?
Yeah.
And knowledge, science doesn't, right? It's a tool of communities, but we need a
Mm-hmm.
science of story and understanding of how to engage with narrative better, how to teach people how to understand it better, in order to face, these great challenges.
Mm-hmm. I've been thinking a lot about community and just the way that it has been sort of systematically broken down over recent years and decades, and just like kind of what that does to specifically a place like North America. Like, Canada is equally bad, I think, in this specific way, but also North America, I think, is such an interesting, I mean, what you said earlier, but like, yeah, the States being like in between two oceans, and therefore like quite literally protected, you know, like, and
Mhm.
Canada is so the same. And we sort of as a kind of counter to the States, while simultaneously, you know, remaining in line with everything the US ever wanted of us, we developed this narrative about Canadians that compared to the US, we're the nice ones, we're the polite ones, we're the ones where things are good, you know. And like, it's a bizarre thing. The older I get, the more I start really paying attention to the world around me, and like particularly North America, because it's so fascinating to me to look at, like, I mean, I've never thought about it in this way, so I'm glad that, I mean, that thinking about these things as this kind of narrative, as this thing that I think it for a long time did build community, and it did probably do a lot of really good things, like American patriotism originally, like, had kind of, there was at its core something good. And in Canada, it really, like, we sort of developed all based on this idea that we are good. And I think that in a lot of ways, it's made a lot of Canadians somewhat nice. And then in a lot of other ways, it's allowed us to completely, like, disregard everything else. Like, one of the things I've seen most recently about Pierre Poilievre, who is our Trump, and he was sitting down with Jordan Peterson, and these two
Jesus Christ.
these two white Canadian men, generationally white Canadian men, had a whole conversation about how 15, 20 years ago, Canada wasn't racist, and how racism in Canada and the idea of racism in Canada has been imported over the last couple of decades. And it just, the level of disconnect and irony involved in two white colonial Canadian men discussing racism being imported is like, it's the most unhinged thing I've ever heard. And it just makes me, it feels so Canadian too. Like, it is both like utter nonsense, and also it is the result of decades of Canada presenting ourselves like the nice ones in North America, like the peaceful ones. Like, the result is then we have these two white men who have benefited from all of the whiteness that colonial Canada has to offer, and they can have what they believe to be a reasonable conversation about racism. I don't know how yeah.
No, it works perfectly. And then, so I'll recap it because, like, you know, again, following the model where, like, narratives go out on their own and do their own things, right? You start out with an aspirational narrative. We're going to be better. We're nicer people. Like, we aren't going to stick to the class and the suffering of the old world. This is the new world. All right. But then that goes from being aspirational to being self-affirmative. Right?
Mm-hmm.
This is who we are now. And once it becomes a feature of your sense of identity and belonging, then you can't be doing things that are bad, right? They're not bad. So then if someone's saying that you're doing something that's bad and that's not nice, well, they're wrong. They just don't understand it, right? And when it comes to dominant ideas, like, we are all at some level stuck to, like, the structures of our birth, right? Of the families we were born in, the racialized structures we were born into. And when you introduce a new idea into that, right? It's like, you know, the graft host problem, right? You're introducing a new organ into a host body. You need to have some type of immunosuppressant for you not to attack it. Right. That's why, like, when the people don't like to say white fragility anymore. Right. But I mean, that type of
that sounds like a very fragile decision to make.
Right. But that's the visceral response to new information that challenges your identity is like an immuno response, right? It doesn't belong here. I can't accommodate this knowledge. We believe in merit and freedom and self-determination. And if somebody tells me there's structural racism that is privileging me, it's downgrading my worth. And I reject it. They must be wrong. Right. And that's the thing. I mean, like, we have the fiction of meritocracy. It's not a total fiction, right? I mean, we don't live in a world that's as completely class-based as, say, the medieval period. We're not serfs, right? But we have racialized things to the extent that it's almost a type of serfdom. But those of us who are outside of that have trouble seeing it because we've been conditioned not to. right? And so, if you're thinking again, I mean, I can't imagine this conversation with Jordan Peterson. Anything with him is horrifying. But if you drop a narrative tradition into a system that can't abide it, it will be rejected and it will be vilified, which
Mm-hmm.
is what happens. What's happening right now? We went 3 years ago, everyone's like, critical race theory is the devil. It's ruining everything, right? And now, like, DEI is evil, right? And then you just break it down like, okay, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Like, we
Mm-hmm.
want like a diverse population, cool. We want to give people an equal opportunity to things, and we also want to make things more inclusive. Like, the whole notion that that is evil, right? To take that and flip it and say these things are all wrong, and actually they're doing the opposite of what they're saying. Like, yes, some of these initiatives are misused. People do things badly, right? But the violent response,
Mm-hmm.
like anytime somebody responds so violently to an idea, right? It's because it's challenging who they think they are,
Mm-hmm.
right? And again, it's like, how do we come like how can we articulate ideas in a way that they'll be effective and that they'll not be subject to the perversion that we're seeing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't have all the answers, but I think a simple thing is like we have a poverty of the way we talk about narrative and the way we train people to deal with it.
Hmm.
And we also, and to add to this, we have a super highway of narrative transmission, which I think is something we don't talk about enough. Like, we are not cognitively capable as human beings to deal with the level of information that we're getting
Mm-hmm.
online, right? And it's also like the best or the most automated, impressive confirmation bias system ever. Like, when we were kids, and when I was a kid, like, if someone said, "Oh, I believe that there are secret lizard people who are really living, like, running the government." And I say this, I grew up in the middle of the woods in southern Maine. We knew a guy who actually was all about the lizard people, and we're like, "All right, you're crazy," right? But now, like, you can go online and find like everything. You can find a group
Yeah.
that supports that, and you create new communities based not about what's good for your local community and the people you know,
Mm-hmm.
but instead for some narrow sense of like alienation or difference, that has no relation to the community that you built around and that you can actually contribute to.
Mm-hmm. Well, and when we don't also value community in the same way as I think was necessary before, like, decades earlier, or rather, I'm saying that poorly. It has been trained out of us not to think about community, particularly in North America, with like the hyper individualism of
Mm,
of suburbs and highways, and just like everything about how we are not meant to be together in this space. We're not meant to like form communities and things. I think
yeah,
that then too, like, the ability the internet has to provide those confirmation biases and all of that then provides its own community that is perhaps far more dangerous than a sort of literal, like a physical community.
yeah.
um
No, and that's like,
yeah.
so to go back to that, to go back to my last chapter, which is really, I don't call it toxic humanism, sorry, heroism. I try to figure out what it is. I just call it what stories do in the world, much less interesting. But the narrative of individualism and heroism itself, is toxic because it emphasizes the individual over the collective,
Yeah.
right? And that's one of the things, that we've talked about this before, but every time I try to teach heroic myth now, I try to say, look, if you actually read Greek heroic myth carefully, right, what it says is Heracles kills his wife and children and is killed by his last wife. Right? It says that Achilles kills myriad Achaeans or causes their death. It says that Odysseus tried really hard, but all of his companions died and then murdered a bunch of people when he comes home. It actually says that, like, heroic individuality is bad for communities,
Mm-hmm.
right? And yet, again, thinking of American exceptionalism,
Mm-hmm.
thinking of the rugged individual in the West, right? For us to have taken the risks to make our nations possible, I mean, you needed some of that rhetoric, right?
Yeah.
Because it's
Yeah.
crazy to cross an ocean and then set up a stupid farm in northern Minnesota when you were fishermen off of Norway, right? You have to believe in this.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, what happens when it's out of control? I mean, right now, what's happening is that we have a ruling class of billionaires who do not believe in a social safety network,
Mm-hmm.
right? Who don't believe that we should be giving back and supporting people, don't think about public health, who think that, what did they say? They said that children who come from poor communities who need free lunch and breakfast are freeloaders. Children, right? I
Wow.
mean, yeah, I mean, things like that. I mean, this is like an absolute devaluing of community in order to serve the self.
Mm-hmm.
It's horrifying because what's the end point,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so the story I focus on in the fifth chapter is a story about Cleomedes the Astropalaean. And the story is told by both Plutarch and Pausanias.
Mm-hmm.
And it's basically there's a guy named Cleomedes. He went to the Olympic Games. He was a boxer. He won his match and was going to get crowned, but the judge said he cheated and he got pissed off that he didn't win, and he went home and attacked the school where he had trained and killed 60 children, and then
Jesus
escaped
Christ.
into the temple of Athena. And then when the people of Astropalaia went to find him, he was gone. And they went to the Delphic Oracle, and the Delphic Oracle said, Cleomedes the Astropalaean is the last of the heroes. Worship him or give him the rights as if he was one. And so, yeah, Pausanias and Plutarch don't make any sense of the story. They just present it. But my
Right.
reading of this is that it's a story, it's the end of the heroic age. And
Yeah.
it's a story that's saying, look, like he's the last hero, he's the final one, because heroes are bad for communities and they do bad things. So give
Yeah.
him the rights, give him his honor that is due, acknowledge him, but acknowledge the full story and the danger. And
Yeah.
so I talk in the last chapter about, and so a lot of what happens in this book is I go between my experiences learning things, like how I learned about similes, my experience like learning about forests as a child, and then about this one, I go back to, when I was first learning about the Iliad and Epic as an undergraduate. I watched the Columbine shootings unfold on television at my college. And like, whether we're talking about Columbine or almost any mass killer, there are two things going on. One, it is a valuing of the individual over the self. It's a rejection of the social compact, and it's a death cult, but it's also a paroxysm like what Cleomedes feels, right? People, and again, there's a reason why it's almost always white dudes,
Yeah.
occasionally not, right? It's because of people who think they have the most right to honor and to a position, and then they don't get it, whether they are not getting, the girls they want to get, or they're not getting glory online they want, whatever it is, they feel left out of their right, and they strike back. And why do they strike back at children? Because they're weak, because they represent the community. They're the last group of people that we, as our individualistic society, will actually put collective resources into. And they
Mm-hmm.
also represent the potential of a future that's better than the shooter's future, right? And so, like, for me, I mean, these stories of the mass shootings are a way to think about the sickness of our society and how that sickness is advanced by story, right?
Mm.
What are the narrative traditions? What are the narrative ideas that set them in a position to take other people's lives? Because, again, I think that they wouldn't be taking lives if they couldn't get guns. That's one thing. So let's just
Yeah.
leave that aside.
First and foremost,
Right.
there's a reason why there's most in down there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. But on the other side, like the impetus to harm others because of loss to your sense of self comes from a type of narrative that communicates our relationship with the world. Right. And that's the thing, when I was starting out writing this book again during COVID, I'm looking around the world falling apart from behind a computer screen. And I'm also looking at my own kids and thinking, well, what am I doing? What am I producing in the world that's any good? Right. I got in real trouble with my dean at the time because I kept saying at meetings that I don't want to have to say in the future that while the world was falling apart, I wrote a big book about a small thing.
Hmm.
Right? Like, what do I know? What do I understand? What do I see from my own studies that can help us understand the world? And for me, it was, all right, it may sound crazy, but like Achilles has the same problem as a school shooter does. Achilles, in a way, I can't believe I'm going to say that, has some of the same problems as Elon Musk, right? He thinks that because he inherited this wealth and he has control of the world, he should always do so and has a right to do whatever he wants to do. The problem with Elon is that he'll never love someone as much as Achilles loved Patroclus, right? He'll never realize that the sense of loss that comes from his own actions. He'll never see somebody else as alive as himself. And so at the end, it's like, it may sound like a really terrible joke that someone who specializes in narrative identifies narrative as a problem, but then also thinks narrative is a solution, right? But like, we have to teach people more about stories. We have to
Yeah.
get them to tell more complex, diverse stories that have different people, that elevate the community, that elevate women and people of color and people of all different types. We need people to see themselves as part of a whole, not as the whole in service of their part.
Yeah. I the way I feel like this, I should have expected it, but I did not expect this
Sorry.
conversation, even though no, in a great way, because it's, I mean, it's so interesting, and like, not to harp too much on it being North America, because this is obviously, like, it is a global thing we're talking about here broadly, but like, I just think, when we're looking at community in that way, and the way that it is, affected by narrative, like you are, it feels to me like North America is so, I think we stand above in a lot of ways, of where we have sort of are the farthest from sort of the community of, I don't know how to phrase it, but I just mean the colonialism of it all is
Well,
in itself like a separation from community, and also like the
yeah.
destruction of existing communities in order to make a new quote unquote community, like, so it just becomes so much more virulent here.
Yeah. I mean, think about it this way. I don't know how much these words are repeated in Canada, right? But in the Declaration of Independence here, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah.
And originally, it wasn't pursuit of happiness, it was pursuit of property, right? But I'm serious, but there's
Oh
nothing in
yeah,
there.
the laugh was that
Like,
I know you're serious.
right, right. But like,
Jesus.
it's not like it's life for me. It's
Yeah.
liberty for me. It's
Yeah.
happiness for me. There's no notion of the cost to others.
Yeah. Well, that's
Right.
what I think about when I hear the American concept of freedom all the time. Because, like, when I hear the American concept of freedom, like, it just, it's so on. I mean, I don't want to say on its face, obviously, because you have to be able to see it. But like, it is not freedom for all Americans. It
No.
never has been. I don't see
Right.
anyone ever forming a convincing argument that it is for everyone. It's freedom for white Americans. And it's the same thing with the white Canadians who came in here and they colonized a people, they committed a genocide, and then they convinced the world that we're the nice ones, we're the peacekeepers. And then
Yeah.
we just live on that narrative. Like, that's our version of freedom, is this being the nice ones, the ones who say
Yeah.
sorry, but it is just as toxic
Yeah.
as,
No.
like,
No.
yeah.
And again, but to go back again to the book, it's like, we tell stories for certain reasons, right?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes they're really, really good reasons. But then there are unintended consequences, and stories go out in the world and they do their own thing,
Yeah.
right? And so the model I use again of parasitism or a virus, is that, like, they can be good for us or bad for us, but we don't actually know until they're released. And
Yeah.
unless we have a method of educating people, unless we really teach people how narrative works in our brains, how we're vulnerable to it, how confirmation bias works, if people don't understand these things, then we're constantly going to be the playthings of narrative. And worse, we're going to be the instruments of people who know how to use narrative better.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. I mean, they weaponize it. Like, we're worried, here, I don't know if we're getting the same news there, but New York Times last week was like, oh, now the CIA is saying that COVID was probably a leak from a lab in China. Right? I'm
Oh
like, okay,
God.
whatever.
Like I
Like,
believe
you know,
that. Yeah,
yeah,
for sure. That seems super likely and not at all propaganda.
right, right,
Definitely.
right. But like we're bioengineering stories all the time. Like we're always taking them and deploying them and manipulating people to their own harm.
Yeah.
And like, and this actually, the failure of people to follow the right protocol for COVID killed more people than the disease would have otherwise,
Oh yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so, how is that? How is our ability to convince people of science not the first public health crisis, right? Same thing with climate change, right? I mean, we like it's there, right?
Yeah.
But people don't want to believe it. I understand why they don't want to believe it. Who wants to believe that the
Yeah.
end of the world is coming, right? It's
And that
really
we
big.
caused it.
Yeah, it's big. We don't think well in the aggregate. There's nothing we can do about it unless we like band together for the collective good, right? And then we'd have to sacrifice certain things. Do you know what the largest polluter, largest contributor to greenhouse gases is in the world?
Is it not factory farming? Or something like that?
I'm pretty sure, I may be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's the U.S. military industrial
Oh,
complex,
that makes sense. Yeah, of
the
course.
U.S. military
And
on
maybe
its
the
own.
other military that is not technically part of the US, but like is part of the
Yeah,
US military
yeah.
complex?
I mean, imagine, like, we have the largest military in the history of time, and what do we do with it? Like, we just fucking have it,
Yeah.
right?
And
It's at some level, it's nuts.
billions and billions and billions.
Huh?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so we talk about the money because we're trained, because we're
Yeah.
we're products of late market capitalism or late stage capitalism. We talk about the money, right? But what is the indirect human death toll, health toll from what it's pouring into the environment?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the easiest thing for everyone, the easiest reason why people in North America specifically, but in the West broadly, love to just not think about it now or not worry about it or think it's fake is because the effects are all happening on the countries that we've already
Right,
turned
right.
into
We've already
countries
said
that we
that
can look down
they're
on.
crappy.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
exactly.
mean, a few years ago, so in Trump's first campaign, I was or first presidency,
Presidency, yeah.
I thought, well, all the drama at the border
Mm.
is really going on in part to ready our population for climate change refugees. They're trying to habituate us, to casualize us to violence at the border
Hmm.
because they have think tanks saying we have water, we have land, the unwashed masses are going to come from the south and we need to stop them,
Hmm.
right? And I used to think I'd say stuff like that to my wife and she'd be like, "You're a little crazy, Joel." Right? But now Trump is back in power and he's obsessed with getting Greenland. Like, come on. Like, this is all about looking forward for resources and not even trying to do anything about climate change.
No,
Like, the
no, they
billionaire
just need to
class
take more.
has said, well, has decided lots of people are going to die because of climate change. We can't stop it. And we're probably better off if tons of people die.
Hmm.
So let's grab as many resources as we can in the process so we and ours will be okay.
Yeah,
Right. And
yeah,
not to, I wasn't going to mention it, but I also think part of the media treatment of the war on Gaza has been similarly to casualize us to violence against others.
yeah,
Right.
yeah,
I think, we, and now in this country, like we are now casualized to the government doing nothing
yeah,
when there's a natural disaster and people are
yeah.
suffering. We're just like, oh, it's somebody else.
Well, yeah,
Can't
they
do
can
anything
still
about
send
it.
7 billion to bomb Gaza.
Yeah, right. Like
Yeah,
spend all that money, but God forbid you rebuild roads in Kentucky.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah,
or help flood
or
victims or fire victims or
right, or
yeah,
like the first thing, it's crazy. Imagine like your neighbor's house is burning, right? And like they're trying to get their kids out of the house, and like instead of helping them, you're like, you know, you should have invested in a better sprinkler system, right?
yeah,
I mean, California's burning, and Trump is like, it's Governor Newsom's fault. Like, that's insane, right? It's
yeah,
climate change. It's like 50 years of bad water policy, right? And yet you're just going to play games with it and lay blame because otherwise, to accept collective responsibility is to act against the basic narrative impetus to focus on your own first.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Sorry.
No. I mean, yeah, like, yeah. I'm glad we're having this conversation. Absolutely. I'm trying to find a way of like wrapping it up slightly positively because I think you have to go soon.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, I mean, I think the positive thing is that like we have dozens of disciplines, sociology, psychology, cognitive science, telling us how stories work, right? And these are narratives as well, but they're telling us that like we're subject to them, we're vulnerable to them, they knit us together and they tear us apart, right? And so we've seen what narrative has done to tear us apart, right? It has a potential to bring us back together if we're willing to understand it and use it and to tell different stories. And so I think that's the real thing, is that we need people who want to craft narratives to believe in. And we need people who want to train people, to teach people to understand narratives critically and to take control of them, rather than be subject to them. And so I don't think it's too late. I just think we need to understand that, it's great if we come up with science that will kill cancer, right? I hope we do it. But we also need to invest in the stories that will make people accept that truth.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so if that's something to evangelize, if that's something to invest in, again, we need a science of story. We need people who believe in it. And we need, put things in education perspectives. We needed to invest in humanities to help people see the value of science. Because otherwise, the only people who are going to benefit from it are the people who have the education and the power to make the distinction on their own.
Yeah. Yes, that was very well said. Oh my God. Great conversation. I don't even know how to pull it. I'm like trying to pull this together now. Yeah, that was very, very fucking interesting and difficult and ultimately inspiring. Thank you so much.
No, thank you for having me and for entertaining my madness.
I mean, as somebody else who sounds like they're usually saying I related to the border reference where you're like, you sound crazy, and then it's like 5 years later you're like, I know I sounded crazy. I'm sorry that I'm just obnoxious with my pessimism, right. But also it's valuable in a way.
Well, and also, so there are a couple things in the book. So I do talk about a few conspiracy theories. I talk about one that involves presidential candidate Romney, Clear Channel, and Mumford and Sons, and the suppression of like black music. So there's some wildness in there.
Yeah.
And if this makes it to the podcast, I want to shout out to Yale University Press and my editor, Heather Gold, for just giving me the license to be a little crazy. And then just like saying, all right, let's do it.
I mean, but I think that makes a big difference. So absolutely a shout out to that, because I think that's what makes a book like this more valuable, is to be able to go a little crazy. Yeah. Is there, I feel like you always have an answer to this that's just no, but is there anything you want to share with the listeners or tell them to read more, or
I mean, I'd love people to read this book, Storylife, and let me know what they think. And my last book, The Many-Minded Man About the Odyssey, is open access now, so you can get it free. You can download it in Kindle for free or download it for e-reader from the website. And then I would just say, keep reading all stories you can critically and thinking about them. And the number one thing, and this is the thing I didn't get to, is, so we talked earlier about how when each of us read a story, we create our own blend. Right? You should read your things in groups and talk to people about it. Because when you talk about stories with people, you hear their interpretations and you create a composite blend together, and that creates a new sense of community. And so in this day and age, we're sitting behind computers, we're doing things alone. I don't know, go to a coffee shop, make a book group, make a Zoom book group, right? Talk about movies together, because that's how you create community.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Great. Yes. Good. All of it. I just thank you so much. This was both very fun and interesting, and also the world's on fire.
Yeah. Sorry.
Nerds, thank you for listening. As always, I am kind of bouncing out a bunch of these pre-recorded episodes while I am over in the UK to do some events and book things and also see all the stolen stuff they won't give back to Greece and thus I have never seen. So this and a few more episodes will be sort of in that realm. It'll be more obvious with the other ones. But I just happened to say that in this one. So here we are. Check out Storylife. There's a link in the episode's description, and generally read more from Joel. Also at the link in the episode's description. It's a Latin phrase that I don't want to try to say right now. Let's Talk About Myths, Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Pengowish is the Hermes to my Olympians, my incredible producer. Select music by Luke Chaos. The podcast is part of the Memory Collective Podcast Network. Bitches! It's a thing. I founded because I wanted to. Learn more from the Memory Collective, which is so much more than podcasts, or it will be. It's not currently, let's not pretend. But you can learn more about the collective and what our goals and aims are at collectivemem.com. That's collective memory, but just MEM. And I am working on a newsletter, so you can sign up for that and you'll get more information. We're also looking at all of the different options we have for reaching listeners and interested learners outside of the increasingly worrisome social media, where you all might notice I've been pretty silent because it's just terrible. And I'm trying to keep myself afloat. But we are looking into that. If anyone has kind of ideas, we're imagining maybe a group Discord where we can be sharing this stuff, maybe something bigger. I'm not totally sure, but, you know, we're here with suggestions. And leave me a question for the next Q&A episode. Link in the episode's description. I'll stop saying that. I am Liv, and I love this shit.